I chose the case brief Parents versus Child Development Services that happened on November 29th and December 4th of 2017. This case is of a mother and a father versus the CDS of York County. The parents state that CDS failed to follow certain procedures required by IDEA and MUSER. These issues include denying them full parental participation, leaving out the term at risk in Section 5A of the IEP, leaving out the fact that they had agreed upon ESY services, though the frequency and intensity would be determined at a later time, and failing to write an IEP at the annual meeting that extends for a full year. Prior to the hearing, it had been agreed upon that CDS needed to provide compensatory education to the 5-year-old child until April 20th of 2018. CDS placed the student at the Margaret Murphy Center for Children, where he would receive his education through to June 30th, when the program ended for the year. The school district he would be transitioning to would become responsible for his education after April 20th of 2018. Since the annual IEP meeting held on September 29, 2017 was within CDS's responsibility and the child was not a part of the district yet, the district's participation was not required. It would become required in the spring during the transition meeting. The parents claimed that they were excluded from the development of the IEP because the site director and case manager of CDS communicated with Susan Macri, special education director of the district the child would be in during the next fall in kindergarten. The communication was to inform Ms. Macri of what was determined at the IEP meeting, with no other input coming from Ms. Macri. Ms. Polk, CDS site manager and case manager, also responded with delay when the mother contacted her in regards to concerns about the IEP after the meeting, which is discussed next. Prior to the annual meeting, the student had a psychological evaluation per request of the parents due to concern he may have a specific learning disability. The psychologist found that while the student does not currently show that he has one, and that diagnosis is not given until at least the child enters kindergarten, he does show that he is at risk for one. This was stated in the IEP meeting, though the statement at risk was never put on the IEP. The team also determined at the meeting that based off of this psychological evaluation, since the child is at risk for a specific learning disability, he will be eligible for extended school year services. The team determined that they would decide on the frequency and intensity of the ESY services at a meeting in the spring. When Ms. Polk was drafting the IEP, she did not include ESY services because that would be beyond CDS's responsibility to the child, which ends on April 20th, 2018. She also stated that she could not put that on there because they hadn't determined the frequency and intensity yet. Also, when writing the IEP, Ms. Polk ended the services on April 20th, 2018 because there was not a representative from the district to commit funds to providing services to the child after that time. However, at the meeting, it was decided that the child would remain in Margaret Murphy until its year ended on June 30th, 2018. The later dates would be decided at the IEP meeting in the spring. So the first issue is, did CDS violate the IDEA by failing to add the phrase at risk in Section 5A of the student's IEP dated September 29th? If so, did they violate IDEA? Did it prevent the student from receiving a free and appropriate public education? And if so, what shall be the remedy? Issue 2. Did the IEP team agree to include extended school year services in the IEP dated September 29th? If so, did CDS fail to include ESY services in the IEP dated September 29th in violation of the IDEA? Does the failure to include ESY services prevent the student from receiving a FAPE? If so, what shall be the remedy? Issue 3. Did CDS fail to develop an annual IEP that included special education and related services for a full year? Did CDS violate the IDEA? Did the violation prevent the student from receiving FAPE? If so, what shall be the remedy? Issue 4. Did CDS fail to allow the parents to meaningfully participate in determining the student's special education instruction and related services in the IEP decision-making process to develop the student's IEP? Did CDS violate the IDEA? Did CDS's actions prevent the student from receiving a FAPE? If so, what shall be the remedy? So the holding on issue 1. Issue 1 was settled at the due process hearing, where they all agreed to modify the annual IEP to read, "There are no special education needs in his academic areas at this time. He is at risk for a specific learning disability. His skills will be monitored through the curriculum in the classroom." Holding for Issue 2. Did the IEP team agree to include ESY services in the IEP? The hearing officer found that the team did agree upon the ESY services and decided that the frequency and duration of the services would be decided later in the year when they had a better idea of the needs of the student. The discussion of ESY was only reflected in the written notice and not in the IEP. Since the written notice is a part of the procedural safeguards rights of the parents and not a legally binding document, the hearing officer found that ESY services should have been included in the IEP. This ruling favors the parents. Since a procedural violation did occur when CDS failed to include ESY services in the IEP, again, this favors the parents. Since the extended school year had not begun yet, the hearing officer decided that failure to include ESY services did not affect the student's fate. This favors CDS. CDS will amend the annual IEP to include ESY services in a statement that the frequency and intensity will be discussed at the transition meeting. The holding for Issue 3. The hearing officer found that CDS failed to write the annual IEP to include programming through June 30th, 2018, which had been decided at the meeting, and that CDS did not have the authority to end the student's specially designed instruction and related services on April 20th. This favors the parents. CDS committed a procedural violation of the IDA by writing that services would end on April 20th rather than what was decided at the meeting to be June 30th. This favors the parents. The error in the IEP did not prevent the student from receiving FAPE because the parents have not complained that the specially designed instruction-related services are inappropriate. This favors CDS. CDS will correct the dates. Issue 4. The hearing officer ruled that CDS did conduct the meeting with the full participation of the parents. It is stated that while CDS's delayed response to the parents was very frustrating, it was not a procedural violation. There is sufficient evidence to show that the parents were active participants throughout the process, and CDS did not exhibit intention to exclude them. There was also insufficient evidence to show that CDS was working with the district outside of the meeting and did not predetermine services. This ruling favors CDS. As a result of these rulings, CDS needed to take the following action within 7 days of the receipt of the decision and order. 1. Include ESY services in the student's annual IEP and indicate that the frequency and duration will be determined by the IEP team at the transition meeting. 2. Change the dates of SDI and related services to end on June 30th, 2018, per the determination of the IEP team. 3. Schedule a transition meeting during the month of April 2018 in order to determine any amendments to the annual IEP. Ensure that all necessary IEP members are present. 4. Notify the due process office in writing immediately after each one of these actions has been taken. So the rationale. First and foremost, the hearing officer referred to IDEA and its procedural requirements when it comes to conducting an IEP and writing the IEP. There were several aspects of this that were pointed out. One is that the IEP is not a form document, meaning that it is not a rigid document that cannot be changed. This is in reference to Ms. Polk saying that she couldn't add in ESY services because they would be deciding the frequency and intensity in the spring transition meeting, and the way the form is created, she wouldn't be able to enter that. Therefore, she omitted it. The hearing officer's reference to the case of Rays versus New York City Department of Education, where the Second Circuit Court of Appeals determined that the Office of State Review aired when it credited testimony of a school witness who explained, while there was a recommendation to provide for only 3 months of one-to-one paraprofessional support, the IEP team did not include it based upon the understand that the student's need for additional support would be reassessed and expanded as needed. The court found that it was inappropriate to take into account the possibility of a mid-year amendments in determining whether an annual IEP, as originally formulated, was substantively adequate. Basically, an IEP that implies a possibility rather than writing it in is not any different than an IEP that is silent on the issue. To allow contemplation and uncertainty would be undermining the core purpose of the IDEA. In addition to this, Muser also states that the IEP team must also determine any anticipated services that the student may need. The hearing officer also points out some IDEA IEP requirements that were not carried out properly in this case, like to include a statement of the child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, describe how the child's disability affects the child's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum, and set out measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals. The IEP must also describe the special education and related services that will be provided so that the child may advance appropriately towards attaining the annual goals, and when possible, be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. IDEA is referenced again to mention FAPE and the criteria of what denial of FAPE would look like. The point of mentioning this is, in this case, is emphasizing that to prove denial of FAPE, then, the procedural inadequacies would cause a deprivation of educational benefits and impede on the parent's opportunity to participate in the decision-making process. There were both issues raised by the parent, so it is important to mention this to show why the hearing officer decided FAPE was not denied for this child. Another mention was that any review of an IEP must appreciate that the question is whether the IEP is reasonable, not whether it is ideal. This is very important to mention in this case because certain aspects of what CDS did that raised issues for the parents was not ideal. However, it was reasonable, therefore not illegal. Parental involvement is addressed again when the hearing officer mentions Muser and its role in enforcing the requirement that the IEP team must include participation and emphasize the school's role to encourage parents to be a full participant in the IEP process. With that, the Muser regulations for who provides FAPE for children 3 to 5, which is CDS, and the process for transitioning these children from CDS services to public school. It states that in the year before the child transitions, the IEP team must meet to create and discuss the annual IEP, and then meet again for a transition IEP meeting in the spring. It also states that a determination about ESY must be made at every IEP meeting for children 3 to 5 in the CDS meeting. Since who is responsible at which time was a large issue in this case, it was mentioned that the education of a child who turns 5 years old on or after October 15th become the responsibility of the public school district in which they live. When I first read this case, I would periodically stop and try to guess how the hearing officer may rule, and if CDS was following the laws. The most difficult part for me to decide was whether it was appropriate that the district was there or not at the annual meeting, since the time frame in this case was a little different than a usual case, with the district taking over on April 20th of 2018, rather than in the fall when the school year started. Review the information on the next slide from the facts section of the case brief on page 6 and discuss how you think CES should have handled the situation. Remember, no procedural violations were committed by not having Ms. Macri, the district representative, there. There are situations that may not be ideal, but still legal. I will upload the slideshow so you all can have more time to review this slide. But thank you so much for choosing to watch my presentation.